In the winter of 1847, the bronze bell of Willow Hollow's Methodist Church rang 13 times at the stroke of midnight, echoing through the snow-covered Vermont hills like a death knell. But here's what made the townspeople's blood run cold. Every soul in the village was accounted for, safe in their homes, yet the bell, a bell that had never rung without human hands, continued its haunting toll throughout the night. What Reverend Samuel Whitmore discovered in the church's hidden archives would reveal that this wasn't the first time the bell had rung for the lost, and those who had vanished before had left behind more than just empty chairs at Sunday service. Before we uncover the dark secrets buried beneath Willow Hollow's Methodist Church, I need you to do something for me. If you're brave enough to hear stories that most people would rather forget, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the mysteries we explore here aren't for the faint of heart. I'm curious to know, from which country and city are you listening to this story? Leave a comment below and let our community of mystery seekers know where you're joining us from. Now let's discover together what really happened in that isolated Vermont village. The story I'm about to tell you comes from fragments of old parish records, whispered memories passed down through generations, and testimonies that were never meant to see the light of day. Willow Hollow sits nestled in a valley between the Green Mountains of Vermont, a community of barely 200 souls, where the winters are long and the summers brief. In 1847, it was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbor's business, where the Methodist Church stood as the heart of social life, and where the sound of the church bell could carry for miles across the snow-covered fields. The church itself was a modest wooden structure, painted white with green shutters, built by the first settlers in 1798. Its bell tower rose 40 feet into the sky, housing a bronze bell that had been cast in Boston and transported by ox cart through treacherous mountain passes. The bell was the pride of the community, its rich tone calling the faithful to worship every Sunday morning and marking the hours of significant events, births, deaths, and the occasional wedding that brought joy to the harsh mountain life. Reverend Samuel Whitmore had arrived in Willow Hollow just 3 months before that fateful winter night. A young man of 28, he had come from the bustling city of Albany, drawn by what he believed was a calling to serve in rural ministry. Samuel was earnest and well-educated, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and a gentle manner that had quickly endeared him to most of his new congregation. The people of Willow Hollow were hardy folk, descended from the original settlers who had carved their farms from the wilderness. Families like the Ashfords, the Merciers, and the Blackwoods had been there for generations, their roots growing deep into the rocky soil like the ancient maples that surrounded the village. They were God-fearing people, but they also carried within them the practical superstitions of those who lived close to nature's unpredictable moods. It was old Martha Ashford who first told Samuel about the bell's peculiar history. She had approached him after Sunday service one crisp October morning, her weathered hands clutching a worn prayer book, her pale blue eyes holding secrets that seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. "Reverend," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something you should know about our bell. It's been ringing on its own for nigh on 50 years, but only when someone's lost or gone missing." Samuel had smiled politely, assuming it was the kind of harmless folklore that often surrounded old buildings, but Martha's expression remained grave. "I've heard it myself, Reverend, 3 times in my lifetime. Once when my cousin Benjamin disappeared during a blizzard in 23, once when young Mary Blackwood vanished on her way to the market, and again when old Henrik Mercier went into the woods and never came back. Each time that bell rang all through the night, as if it was calling them home." The night of December 15th, 1847, began like any other winter evening in Willow Hollow. Samuel had finished his evening prayers and was settling into his study with a cup of hot cider and his Bible when the first chime echoed through the darkness. It was just past midnight, and the sound made him look up from his reading with mild curiosity. The bell continued to ring, slow, deliberate strokes that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly rhythm. Samuel counted each chime. 1, 2, 3. all the way to 13 before it fell silent. Then, after a moment that stretched like an eternity, it began again. Samuel rose from his chair and moved to the window, pressing his face against the cold glass. The church stood silhouetted against the snow, its bell tower dark and empty. No wind moved through the valley that night, and the snow fell in perfect stillness, muffling all sound except for the haunting bronze voice that continued to call out across the sleeping village. By the time Samuel had dressed and made his way through the knee-deep snow to the church, several other villagers had emerged from their homes. Thomas Ashford, Martha's son, stood in his doorway with a lantern, his face pale with recognition. Sarah Blackwood clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her eyes wide with the same fear that Samuel had seen in Martha's gaze weeks earlier. "Reverend," Thomas called out as Samuel approached the church, "you need to check on everyone when the bell rings like this." But Samuel was already pushing through the heavy wooden doors of the church, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The interior was dark and empty, the pews standing in silent rows like sentinels keeping watch over some terrible secret. He climbed the narrow stairs to the bell tower, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. The bell hung motionless in its housing, the thick rope that operated it tied securely to its post. There was no wind, no movement, no explanation for the sounds that continued to ring out into the night. Samuel examined the mechanism carefully, looking for any sign of tampering or malfunction, but found nothing. As he descended the stairs, the bell rang again. 13 deliberate chimes that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. This time, Samuel stood directly beneath it, watching as the massive bronze bell remained perfectly still while its voice filled the air around him. When he emerged from the church, he found that more villagers had gathered in the small square. Men carried lanterns and worried expressions, while women whispered urgent prayers. Thomas Ashford approached him immediately. "Reverend, we need to do a head count. Make sure everyone's accounted for." What followed was a thorough search of every home in Willow Hollow. Samuel accompanied the men as they went door to door, checking on each family, each elderly resident, each child. The search took nearly 2 hours, but the result was both a relief and a source of growing dread. Every single person in the village was present and accounted for. Yet the bell continued to ring throughout the night, its bronze voice carrying across the valley like the call of some ancient spirit that refused to be ignored. In the weeks that followed, Samuel found himself unable to shake the memory of that night. The bell had finally fallen silent just before dawn, but its echo seemed to linger in his mind. He began to ask careful questions about the church's history, about the families who had lived in Willow Hollow for generations, and about the mysterious disappearances that Martha Ashford had mentioned. What he discovered was that the bell's unexplained ringing was not merely local folklore. It was a pattern that had been documented in fragments and whispers for nearly half a century. Each time the bell had rung without human intervention, someone from the community had indeed been missing. But the strangest part was that in many cases, the missing person had never been reported as lost until after the bell had started ringing. Samuel began to keep detailed records of his conversations with the older residents. From Henrik Mercier's widow, he learned that her husband had disappeared on a clear autumn day in 1834. But it wasn't until the bell began ringing that night that anyone realized he was gone. From the Blackwood family, he heard the story of young Mary, who had vanished in 1841 while walking to the general store. A journey that should have taken 20 minutes, but had somehow stretched into eternity. The more he learned, the more questions arose. Why did the bell seem to know about these disappearances before anyone else? What connection did these missing people have to each other? And most disturbing of all, why had their disappearances been so easily accepted by the community, as if losing neighbors to the wilderness was simply a part of life in Willow Hollow? It was during one of these conversations that Samuel first heard about the Founder's Room, a space in the church basement that had been sealed off for decades. Martha Ashford mentioned it almost casually, as if it were common knowledge that no one discussed. "Oh, that old room," she said when Samuel asked about it. My grandfather told me it was where the first minister kept his private papers. Been locked up since before I was born. The key was lost long ago, or so they say. But Samuel was nothing if not thorough. That evening, he conducted his own search of the church basement, using a lantern to illuminate the stone walls and wooden support beams. In the far corner, behind a stack of old hymn books and unused church supplies, he found what he was looking for. A heavy wooden door, painted the same color as the walls, with an iron lock that looked far more substantial than anything else in the building. The lock was old, but not impossible to break. Samuel spent the better part of an hour working at it with tools from the church's small maintenance closet, until finally, with a grinding sound that seemed to echo through the entire building, it gave way. The founder's room was smaller than Samuel had expected, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with stone walls that wept moisture and a ceiling so low he had to duck his head. But it was what the room contained that made his blood run cold. Wooden shelves lined 3 of the walls, filled with leather-bound ledgers, rolled documents and papers that seemed to chronicle decades of careful record-keeping. But these weren't ordinary church records. As Samuel opened the first ledger, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the yellowed pages, he realized he was looking at a meticulous documentation of every disappearance in Willow Hollow's history. The earliest entries dated back to 1798, written in the spidery handwriting of Reverend Josiah Whitmore, Samuel's own great-uncle, whose name he had inherited along with his calling to the ministry. The record showed that people had been disappearing from Willow Hollow since the very founding of the settlement, always in the same pattern. They would leave their homes for routine errands or daily tasks and simply never return. But what chilled Samuel to the bone was the notation system that his great-uncle had developed. Next to each name was a symbol, sometimes a star, sometimes a circle, sometimes a cross. And in the margins, in the same careful handwriting, were notes about payment schedules, quantities, and references to arrangements with the traders. As Samuel read deeper into the records, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The disappearances weren't random acts of nature or simple misfortune. They were systematic, planned, and they were connected to something that his great-uncle had referred to repeatedly as the Old Agreement. One entry, dated September 15, 1823, was particularly disturbing. Benjamin Ashford selected for the autumn arrangement, payment of $40 silver confirmed by the Connecticut traders. The bell rang from sunset to sunrise, as is customary. The family has been prepared with the usual explanation regarding the blizzard story. B.A. will be reported as lost in the early storm, though the weather has been clear for days. Samuel's hands shook as he turned the pages. Entry after entry revealed the same pattern. Names, payments, and references to traders who seemed to be purchasing human beings from the supposedly God-fearing community of Willow Hollow. But the most disturbing discovery came in a separate ledger, bound in black leather and marked with a symbol that Samuel didn't recognize. This book contained what appeared to be correspondence between his great-uncle and various individuals, including detailed maps of underground tunnels and references to the northern route and passage to the Canadian territories. Samuel realized with growing horror that Willow Hollow had been a way station on the Underground Railroad, but not the kind that history books celebrated. This was a corruption of that noble network, a place where escaped slaves were sold back into bondage rather than guided to freedom. The bronze bell, according to the records, had been specially designed with a mechanism that could be triggered remotely from the basement. It served as a signal to the traders that another shipment was ready for collection. The bell's midnight ringing wasn't supernatural. It was a carefully orchestrated business arrangement that had been operating for decades. As Samuel absorbed the full horror of what he had discovered, he began to understand why the bell had rung on that December night. Someone else knew about the room, about the records, about the terrible secret that had been hidden beneath the church for 50 years. And they were warning him to stop digging. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Some members of the current congregation were descendants of those who had been involved in the original conspiracy. The very people who had helped him search for missing villagers that night were the inheritors of a legacy built on human suffering. Samuel's mind raced through the implications. The Ashfords, the Merciers, the Blackwoods, all families whose names appeared repeatedly in the records, sometimes as conspirators, sometimes as victims. The neat categorization of the missing people wasn't random. It was based on their usefulness to the operation and their likelihood to be missed. But who was still involved? Who had triggered the bell that night as a warning? And most terrifying of all, who else might disappear if Samuel didn't handle this carefully? As if in response to his thoughts, Samuel heard footsteps in the church above. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to be moving toward the basement stairs. He quickly closed the ledgers and extinguished his lantern, plunging the room into complete darkness. The footsteps stopped at the top of the basement stairs, and Samuel heard the distinctive creak of the old wooden door being opened. A voice called down. Thomas Ashford's voice, though it carried a tone that Samuel had never heard before. "Reverend Whitmore, I saw your light from outside. Is everything all right down there?" Samuel's heart pounded as he realized that Thomas could see the broken lock on the founder's room door. There was no innocent explanation for his presence here, no way to hide what he had discovered. "Just checking on some old church records, Thomas," Samuel called back, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll be up in a moment." But Thomas was already descending the stairs, carrying a lantern that cast his shadow in long, threatening angles across the basement walls. When he reached the bottom, his eyes immediately went to the open door of the founder's room. "That room's been sealed for good reason, Reverend," Thomas said quietly. "Some secrets are better left buried." Samuel emerged from the room, closing the door behind him, but he could see in Thomas's expression that the gesture was meaningless. The man knew exactly what Samuel had found. "How long have you known?" Samuel asked. Thomas set his lantern on a nearby shelf and studied Samuel's face in the flickering light. "My family's been keeping the secret for 3 generations, Reverend, just like the Merciers and the Blackwoods and half a dozen other families in this valley." "But it's over now," Samuel said desperately. "The Underground Railroad, the slave trade, it's all different now. You don't have to continue this." Thomas shook his head slowly. "You don't understand, Reverend. It never stopped. The business just evolved." The truth that Thomas revealed in that basement room was more horrifying than anything Samuel had imagined. The network that had once facilitated the return of escaped slaves to their owners had indeed adapted to changing times. But rather than disappearing, it had transformed into something even more sinister. "The traders still come through," Thomas explained, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "But now they're looking for different kinds of people. Drifters, wanderers, folks who won't be missed. The kind of people who show up in towns like ours looking for work or shelter." Samuel felt sick as he realized the implications. The missing people, they weren't from Willow Hollow at all. Most of them, no. They were travelers, people passing through who made the mistake of staying too long. The bell rings when it's time for them to move on. But why continue? Why keep this going? Thomas's expression hardened. "Because it's profitable, Reverend. Because these mountains are full of people who need things done quietly, and they're willing to pay well for the service. And because stopping now would mean admitting what we've been doing for 50 years. Samuel thought of the night the bell had rung, of the careful head count that had accounted for every villager. There was someone here that night, wasn't there? Someone you were planning to? A young man who'd been working at the Mercier farm for the past month. Good worker, but he'd started asking too many questions about the families who'd moved on before him. The bell was supposed to signal that he was ready for collection, but the traders were delayed by the storm. Where is he now?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Gone. The traders came through 2 days later. By then, we'd told him his services were no longer needed, and he left town thinking he'd been dismissed." Samuel realized with growing horror that the system was so efficient, so well organized, that the victims often cooperated in their own disappearance. They were told they were being released from employment, or that they'd been found work elsewhere. or that their families had sent for them. They left willingly, never suspecting that they were walking into a trap. "The bell mechanism," Samuel said. "It's not supernatural at all." Thomas almost smiled. "There's a rope system that runs from the basement to the bell tower, hidden in the walls installed when the church was built. My great-grandfather was one of the original builders. He made sure the church would serve multiple purposes. And you're telling me this because you're a Whitmore," Thomas said simply. "Your great-uncle started this operation. Your family has a stake in keeping it going. We figured once you understood the history, you'd see the wisdom in maintaining tradition." But Samuel was already shaking his head. "I won't be part of this. I can't be part of this." Thomas's expression grew cold. "Then you have a choice to make, Reverend. You can join us, or you can become one of the people who decides to move on from Willow Hollow." Samuel spent the rest of that night in his study, staring at the fire and weighing his options. He could flee Willow Hollow, abandon his calling, and spend the rest of his life wondering if more innocent people had died because of his cowardice. Or he could stay and fight, knowing that he was vastly outnumbered and that his own life was in danger. But by morning, he had made his decision. Rather than confronting the conspiracy directly, Samuel chose a different path. He began documenting everything he had learned, creating detailed copies of the records in the founder's room and preparing them for shipment to authorities in Albany and Boston. But more importantly, he began a careful campaign to warn potential victims. Working with the few families in Willow Hollow who were not involved in the conspiracy, Samuel established a network of watchers who would alert him whenever strangers arrived in town. He made it his business to befriend these travelers, to learn their stories, and when necessary, to help them leave town safely before they could be selected for the traders. The bell rang 3 more times during Samuel's tenure in Willow Hollow, but each time, the intended victim had already been quietly guided to safety. The system began to break down as the supply of willing victims dried up, and the financial incentives that had kept the conspiracy alive for decades began to disappear. Thomas Ashford and his co-conspirators eventually realized that Samuel would never be turned. But they also understood that killing a minister would bring the kind of attention they couldn't afford. Instead, they began a campaign to force him out of town, spreading rumors about his mental stability and his fitness for ministry. Samuel endured their harassment for 2 years, long enough to ensure that the trafficking network had been completely dismantled. In 1849, he quietly left Willow Hollow, taking with him complete documentation of the conspiracy and the names of every person who had been involved. The records he compiled were eventually used to prosecute several members of the network, though many of the original conspirators had died of old age by the time the legal proceedings began. The church in Willow Hollow was eventually abandoned, and the bell that had rung for so many lost souls was removed and melted down for scrap metal. But Samuel's final report, preserved in the archives of the Methodist Church in Albany, contained a haunting postscript. "The evil that men do in the name of tradition and profit can outlast generations. The bell of Willow Hollow may be silent now, but the echoes of its voice will ring forever in the hearts of those who know the truth." Today, Willow Hollow is a ghost town, its buildings long since collapsed, and its secrets buried beneath decades of New England snow. But sometimes, on quiet winter nights, locals in the surrounding valleys report hearing the distant sound of a church bell, ringing 13 times in the darkness, as if it's still calling out for the lost and the forgotten. This story reminds us that the greatest horrors are often hidden behind the most respectable facades, and that sometimes the most sacred places can harbor the darkest secrets. What do you think about this tale of Willow Hollow? Do you believe that some secrets are too terrible to remain buried forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into America's hidden past and want to explore more mysteries that history tried to forget, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this story with someone who appreciates the darker side of our heritage. Until next time, remember that the past is never truly past. It's always waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to look.